Book 5, Chapter 8. It is good for us to be here. The true revelation of Jesus as the Messiah was for the apostles alone. The time had not yet come for them to reveal what they had themselves not fully understood. So he charged them to tell no man that Jesus was the Christ. But upon the basis of their confession, he was able to begin immediately to show them the true nature of his messiahship, where it was destined to lead him, and what it was to mean to them. From this time forth, Jesus began to show unto his disciples how he must go unto Jerusalem, and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. This revelation of a suffering and rejected Messiah was too much for Peter. His love for his Lord was too great to accept the terrible picture of imminent persecution and cruel death. "Be it far from thee, Lord," he burst out, "this shall not be unto thee." Ah, Peter, your very love can be a stumbling block to yourself and an offense to your Lord. Its stimulus is human and not spiritual. The temptation which Peter suddenly brought to Jesus at this critical moment was greater because of the horror and despair in the disciples' eyes. He could bear the enmity of his enemies better than the love of his friends. Every disciple has to learn that the love of our nearest and dearest may be a greater danger to our spiritual welfare than the opposition of many foes. The test must always lie in the source and the nature of their love, whether it is human or spiritual. "Get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offense unto me." It was not that Peter loved too much, nor that Jesus loved Peter less, but, "Thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." In a moment, the sudden temptation was gone. The sword thrust from his impetuous disciple was healed. The road to Jerusalem shone clearly down the valley to the south. With characteristic beauty, Jesus used Peter's lapse to show the disciples their part in the purpose of God which lay before him. The cross, which had forced a cry of horror from Peter's lips, was the lot of the disciples too. Whether it became a real one was not important. Their life as men who followed him must be a life of sacrifice, denying the desires of the flesh and savoring only the things that be of God. He had come to give life. Accepting this gift meant losing many of the glittering prizes the world held out. But from the ruins of the temporal loss, there would emerge a life that was of far greater value than the present conquest of all the world. Finally, Jesus put their messianic expectation in its true perspective. They had been right to expect a king who would come in majesty and power to exalt the nation and establish a worldwide kingdom of righteousness and peace. But this cross, which had so horrified Peter, must come before the crown. Then, in the fullness of time, the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then shall he reward every man according to his works. From now on, Jesus was to maintain that perspective and make it clearer for them in teaching and parable. Meanwhile, to give them an earnest of its fulfillment and courage to bear their cross and follow him, Jesus promised, "Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death, till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." About 6 days later, Jesus fulfilled that promise, and 3 had the unspeakable honor of beholding his glory. We have no record of the events of those days, but we may be certain they were occupied in preparation and prayer. Then the day came for which Jesus seemed to be waiting. He took with him Peter, James, and John, and climbed with them towards the top of one of the lower heights of Mount Hermon. The choice of the 3 most intimate disciples was undoubtedly of supreme importance. They had already been drawn apart to witness the raising of the little girl in the death chamber at Capernaum. They were yet to be nearest him in his hour of deepest sorrow. Now they were about to witness the moments of his final dedication to the cross, and to see the glory and the victory that lay beyond the desolation of suffering. We can picture this little group starting on their way when the midday sun was past, climbing steadily up into the higher passes of the giant massif that towers into the sky until its peaks dominate the whole land of Israel. Reaching the snow-filled crevices, they would be able to pause and trace the course of the Jordan as it cut through its mountain walls and tumbled into the broad expanse of the Sea of Galilee. As the evening approached, the peaks above them would blush in the dying rays of the sun. The fissures and chasms would become sharply defined, while the great bulk of the mountain itself would cast its own shadow out across the eastern plains toward Damascus. Gradually the shadows would lengthen. The sun, now a ball of fire, would slip down to be extinguished in the deep waters of the Mediterranean. Darkness would creep up the Jordan Valley until its vapors stole towards them from the ravines below. Presently the rising moon would turn the heavens into a luminous depth of light. One by one the stars would begin their night vigil over the slumbering earth. Jesus had brought his 3 most loved disciples into a high mountain apart to pray. Here, remote from the haunts of men, they communed with God. How long they prayed, we do not know. The disciples, probably a little apart from their Lord, grew heavy with sleep. They had climbed steadily for hours, and, as often happens, the intensity of their prayer brought a physical reaction. Exhaustion proved too strong for sustained devotion. For Jesus, it was far otherwise. It seems as though he had come in obedience to the call from his Father. As he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became white and glistening. The disciples opened their wondering eyes to behold a scene of unearthly radiance. Their Lord was bathed in the light of heaven. Talking with him were 2 men whom, with the heightened sensitivity of spiritual perception, they immediately recognized as Moses and Elijah. The Son of God, who had come to fulfill the law and the prophets, was in earnest discourse with their greatest representatives. They were talking of the death which Jesus would accomplish at Jerusalem. The vision faded. The 2 figures had gone. Peter, now thoroughly roused from the stupor of sleep, cried out, because his impetuous nature demanded expression. But he wist not what to say. All that he knew was that he wanted this wondrous glory perpetuated. "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias." Peter had yet to learn that only the road to Jerusalem leads to the time when the tabernacle of God will be with men. The peaks of Hermon had glowed, but palely in the excess of light. Slowly they were obscured altogether as a cloud descended upon them. But it was no ordinary cloud. It must have been luminous with the aura of glory. The disciples trembled with unspeakable dread as it enveloped them. The stillness was broken by a voice from the mists. "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." How long the disciples lay prostrate, we do not know. But a gentle hand touched them, and they heard a dear, familiar voice. "Arise, and be not afraid." They looked up to see Jesus standing over them. Jesus in his rough homespun robe. The cloud had gone. The moon shone coldly on the distant peaks. We cannot read the account of this sacred experience without a sense of gratitude that we have been allowed a glimpse of that night of destiny. Our reverence and awe should be too deep to allow us to discuss its nature. We have seen what the disciples saw. We dare not seek to know what Jesus saw and heard. With Peter we wist not what to say, for the brightness of the glory fills our hearts. But we can understand the effect of this night of wonder. For Jesus, surely, it was an experience of the joy that was set before him. It was a renewed anointing for his death, to the glory of his Father and the redemption of all mankind. The disciples would feel that nothing could ever be the same again. John would later write, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word of life. That which we have seen and heard declare we unto you, that ye also may have fellowship with us." Peter would write, "For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory, when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And this voice, which came from heaven, we heard when we were with him in the holy mount." But meanwhile, John would remember that moment as he looked up at the bowed head covered with blood and sweat. Peter would remember it after he had cried, "I never knew him," and would go out into the night and sob as though his heart must break. Book 5, Chapter 9. Help thou mine unbelief. When the morning rays of sun turned to gold the tops of Hermon, it was in truth the dawning of another day for Jesus and his 3 disciples. As they made their way down to the plains where men lived and toiled, there can be little doubt that, like Moses before them, they wist not that their faces shone. The 3 apostles had been shown something which even their master could not have taught them. Now, in the cool sunlit air, they would be conscious of the peace which always follows communion with God. As soon as they reached the foot of the mount, they would reveal to their fellow disciples something of the wonder they had seen. They would tell them that there was no longer need for concern, whatever may befall. Jesus was the Son of God, and they had seen his glory. Yet this was not to be. Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen again from the dead. This revelation was for them alone. An experience like that cannot be shared. No words could begin to convey what God's glory had revealed. This remains true today. If in God's grace there come moments when Christ enters into our hearts, and we feel the strength of his presence and the power of his love, we are conscious that we have had one experience that we cannot share. There may be times when deep calls unto deep, and on some moorland tour or in the flickering light of a winter fire, we unexpectedly find ourselves confiding in a kindred soul. These are rare and joyous hours. But such experiences can never be related with the intention of demonstrating the power and beauty of Christ in the human heart. Each one yearns for the hour of visitation and waits in hope and prayer. And one day he comes, and like Peter, James, and John, we find ourselves reluctant to leave the mountain heights and descend to the plains below. It was not surprising that the thoughts of the 3 disciples should be occupied with the things they had witnessed. The scribes had taught that Elijah would be revealed before the coming of the day of the Lord. They wondered how this might be, and what part the vision had in the course of events. "Master," they said, "why say the scribes that Elijah must first come?" Jesus did not hesitate to confirm the accuracy of the scribes' interpretation of the message of Malachi. He told them that it was true that before the final manifestation of Messiah, Elijah would be sent to restore all things and prepare for the establishment of the kingdom. Yet, as is so often seen in God's dealings with man, there was also a sense in which Elijah had already appeared in the person of John the Baptist, and the nation had done to him whatsoever it listed. The scribes had not the complete picture of the 2 Elijahs and the 2 advents of the Messiah. Jesus brings that out in a counter-question recorded in Mark. How is it written of the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be set at naught? If John's work saw the complete fulfillment of the preparation for the Messiah and his kingdom, where is the place of Christ's suffering? The descent of Jesus to the plain bears a striking resemblance to the coming of Moses from the mount. From the glory, harmony, and peace of heaven, he returns to discord, mockery, and unbelief on the earth. 3 factors were responsible for the scene which he witnessed. The 9 remaining disciples had lost their Lord, and with him had gone their faith. An urgent case of need had come to test that faith, and the scribes, no longer content for Jesus to come into their midst, had tracked him up the Jordan Valley. A man had brought his terribly afflicted son to be healed, and learning the whereabouts of Jesus, probably from the people of Caesarea Philippi, he came to the foot of the mount, followed by crowds from the city. In the absence of Jesus, the man had appealed to the disciples, but they had proved impotent. This presented a wonderful opportunity for the scribes, who took full advantage of their failure to bring ridicule upon their Lord. So it was that the Son of Man returned from receiving the glory and honor of his Father to encounter the mockery and unbelief of men. His coming had a profound effect upon the people. Mark tells us, "And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him saluted him." We wonder whether the disturbance fully accounts for their amazement and greeting. Is it not possible that the light of God's glory still lingered about him? And is it not a significant contrast that when Moses came down from the mount, his shining face brought fear to the people, but the coming of Jesus from his Father's presence brought warmth and joy? With his coming, the tumult ceased. The scribes were embarrassed by their accusations, the disciples by their failure. "What question ye with them?" But the scribes, so quick to condemn him in his absence, had nothing to say. The explanation was made by the man who was responsible for the disturbances. Kneeling before Jesus, he told him that he had brought his only son, who was pining away in the grip of epilepsy. He was dumb, and so terribly afflicted that he writhed, foaming on the earth, gnashing his teeth. And, he said, "I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not." The cry of Jesus seems to have in it something of the contrast between the mountain heights and this vale of tears, the glory of the Father's presence and the reproach of men. It has in it, too, the yearning for the completion of his work, that all this suffering and discord may cease. It was a cry of protestation which included them all, the mocking scribes, the unbelieving disciples, the anxious Father. "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you?" But his rebuke was no refusal. His impatience of the willful need of man was not impatience of his ministry of love. That is inexhaustible. Until death itself is swallowed up in victory, the gracious invitation will remain. "Bring him unto me." Coming to Jesus, the poor youth was seized with a paroxysm, such as his father had described. Jesus watched him as he writhed at his feet. The commotion that had followed the disciples' failure, the challenge of the scribes, the shouting of the people, had made the atmosphere a tense and difficult background for the calm confidence of faith. Jesus sought to bring peace into the disturbed heart of the Father, which would inspire in him that belief which alone would save his Son. Seeking, as he always did, those adequate grounds of faith, Jesus turned to the man and asked him how long he had been like this. "Of a child," he answered, and took the opportunity of telling him more of the effect of the malady on his son. So great was his distress that the boy lost all control of his faculties, often falling into fire and water. "But," he cried in sudden entreaty, "if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Ah, foolish man, let the greatness of thy need excuse thy faithless heart. As well may he take a bucket to the brink of the fathomless ocean and cry, "If thou canst." With infinite love, Jesus turned the question around, and doing so, gave him an impetus for faith. He was looking pleadingly at Jesus, yearning to see his son restored. Jesus led him back to the inmost recesses of his own heart. "Do not demand it of me. I am willing. Demand it of yourself. If thou canst believe." His son was in his hands. His faith alone could release the power that Jesus was willing to give. In a moment, the man saw it. A spark of grace had been kindled in his heart, and by its light he saw for the first time the depths of his faithlessness. It will always be so. Jesus alone can reveal to us the exceeding sinfulness of sin. He alone can show us the fetters of unbelief chaining us to our prison wall. The Father realized he could be his son's worst enemy. Implicit in that knowledge was belief in Jesus. He cried out pathetically, yet triumphantly, "Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief." Clinging desperately to Jesus, conscious only of his insufficiency, but praying for help, he was, all unknowingly, a wonderful example of true faith. For what can we add to that? Tears of penitence, acknowledgement of weakness, words of profound conviction. These are the ingredients of faith. We hardly need to hear the sequel. And Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the child and delivered him again to his Father. When they were alone, the 9 disciples asked Jesus why they had so dismally failed. "Because of your unbelief," he answered. "For verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer." They had thought that they had faith in him, but it was a profession grown languid in the ebb and flow of daily life. It was not a faith which could win for them a place with their companions on the heights of Hermon, nor save the name of their Lord Jesus Christ from shame on the plains below. The faith that Jesus required of them was an intense, vitalizing force which sought only the kingdom of God and His righteousness, that was sustained by prayer. Faith of that kind, though only as small as the proverbial mustard seed, could remove mountains. The smallest faith, if it is true faith, can overcome the greatest obstacles, because it is the channel which links the believer to the infinite power of God. Without it, we can do nothing. With it, we can do all things. Book 5, Chapter 10. For Me and Thee. The distant parts of the land of Israel were no longer secluded resting places for Jesus and His apostles. The scribes had come, and the multitudes were once more gathering around. Moreover, the purpose of the northward journey had been accomplished. The glory of the mount was more than a memory. It was for Jesus a glorious incentive, and for the 3 disciples a precious and unforgettable secret. The little company, therefore, made its way southwards to Galilee, but not this time to the crowds who again would have eagerly responded to the teaching and the power. Mark says that they passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it, for he taught his disciples. Nor do the evangelists leave us in doubt concerning the nature of his teaching. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him. And after that he is killed, he shall rise the 3rd day. A few hours before, Jesus had cast an unclean spirit out of a lunatic. He takes no step to cast the devil out of his own treacherous disciple, nor does he seek to move the mountain that rears its skull-shaped form outside the city wall. His great desire is that his disciples shall see the full picture of their Lord's destiny. They must realize that before the world can be for the Messiah must be for the world. Let these sayings sink down into your ears, he said. They were exceedingly sorrowful, but they could not understand. Peter, their spokesman, was silent. The sting of the Lord's rebuke was fresh and painful. So though they were bewildered and depressed, they were afraid to ask him. It would seem that Jesus remained in Galilee for some little time, avoiding public notice and instructing the disciples. When at last they returned to the familiar streets of Capernaum, the collectors of the temple dues approached Peter privately and asked whether his master offered the half shekel, which under the law was payable by every Jew over 20. It is not certainly known whether or not the rabbis were exempt from this yearly payment, but it appears the collectors approached Peter in a spirit of deference and inquiry rather than criticism. Either from his knowledge of the past, or in his confidence that Jesus would willingly render what God required in his law, Peter answered for his master without hesitation. When he reached the house, he found Jesus waiting for him, fully aware of what had taken place. But there was no reproof in the Lord's words, "What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers?" "Of strangers," he answered readily. "Then," said Jesus, "are the children free." Peter must have realized at once how hastily he had committed his Lord. On his own recent acknowledgment, Jesus was the Son of the King of Heaven. The temple was his Father's house, and on those grounds alone there could be no question of his paying for its maintenance. But the implication was deeper than that. The Son of God was greater than the temple made with hands. He was the true sanctuary, of which the building was only the type. The flowing of the blood of bulls and goats would be finally staunched when the blood flowed from his broken body. The glory of God would leave the temporary abode of Mount Moriah and be revealed in the Son. When his perfect offering was accomplished with his approaching sacrifice, the present building was ready to vanish away. A new and living way into the holiest was about to be prepared through the veil of his flesh. The half-shekel atonement money required of the Israelites was to be fully paid within the year. The Son was free from the impositions required for the physical temple. In prospect, the apostles were free too, because they were associated with the true temple of God. They were to pay their dues to Him, not the contribution of a fixed sum, but the abiding dedication of their whole life as sons of God and ministers of the true temple. Having made the position clear to Peter and thus protected him from any misunderstanding in the future, Jesus once more manifested that humility of spirit which characterized all his actions. Nevertheless, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast a hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. Take that, and give it unto them for me and thee. It cannot be without significance that Peter must render this service for his Lord in his natural occupation as fisherman. In this act of obedience, he would learn that the heavenly treasury was ever open to the faithful child of God, despite the protest of reason. How much work of the Lord has been neglected because we have not the faith to go to the water's edge and throw out our hook. Peter knew the ways of the sea. He could have easily argued against the reasonableness of his commission. But natural knowledge is irrelevant and can be dangerous when we are under the instructions of Christ. Peter had arrived at that blessed state where he had more confidence in his Lord than in the familiar paths of his daily life. Some features in the events of the last few days had disturbed the disciples. Stimulating thoughts which they would be loath to admit were often in their minds. It concerned their status in the kingdom of God. Only 3 of them had been selected to witness the transfiguration, whilst 9 remained below. Jesus was frequently to be seen in tender intimacy with John. In the most natural way, the synagogue officials had approached Peter as the spokesman of the apostles. It is not unlikely that the favored ones felt their preeminence was a happy augury for the day when their master revealed himself as the nation's Messiah. It is even more likely that some of the others were resentful at what they felt was favoritism, and moved by envy, they stubbornly resisted the real or imagined claims of their brethren. With Jesus out of earshot, conversation turned to dispute. The disciples returned to the estate from which they had been called, pressing their rights, forgetful of the claims of their Lord. As they neared Peter's house and realized that they must meet their master, they would make hasty attempts to curb their tempers, but their red faces and darkly glowing eyes would reveal how imperfectly they had succeeded. "What was it that you disputed with yourselves by the way?" So he knew. His absence had not prevented his sharing their conversation. He could enter into their moments of nobility and be with them in their hour of shame. His love would encourage them in the one, yet would not abandon them in the other. Sensing this, the disciples openly asked him, "Who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus answered them unexpectedly. He did not say, "He that loveth most," or "he that serveth best." His answer is at once no answer, and the only possible answer. If any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all. Making his reply even more eloquent, he leaned forward and drew towards him one of the children who were so often to be seen near him. Taking him in his arms, he said, "Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted, and become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever will humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." They were to find again the childlike trust that loves unquestioningly and has utter confidence in the Father, to regain the simplicity of those years which were free from the selfish speculations of later days. This is to understand the call of Jesus and to become children of the kingdom. We are only truly converted when, having gone forth to meet the stress and storms of life, we emerge from the conflict with a trust in God as strong as that which we had shown as children in our earthly parents. We can only win such a victory by unswerving loyalty to Christ and uncompromising obedience to His precepts. To offend one of Christ's little ones is to bring down the judgment of heaven. Offense will come against the servant as against the master, but woe unto that man by whom the offense cometh. Because the power of their Father is commensurate with His love, the children are never beyond the scope of His care, however bitter the persecution they may suffer, and their final emergence into His presence is assured. Indeed, although their enemies may persistently assault them, there remains a very real sense in which they cannot be offended. Great peace have they which love thy law, and nothing shall offend them. The world is not the only offender of Christ's little ones. Where his love is not fully present, there is always grave danger of offense by word and example. Jesus warns his own disciples, "Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones. For I say unto you, that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven." We may not often think of this intimate ministration of the angels. We are content to consider them as powerful messengers of God, accomplishing his great purposes, commissioned to the earth on dramatic occasions when the Eternal Father condescends to reveal his will to men, but for the most part attending the throne of God in glory. Here, Jesus shows another work that is assigned to them, and pondering his words, we become conscious that similar references to the work of angels in other parts of Scripture shine in a new light. When a child of the world becomes a child of God, it is the Father's good pleasure to appoint one of his holy ones to have him in his keeping. Thus it appears that whilst they are above and beyond us in our present state, they serve us, because we are called to the glory of Christ. The world itself received the service and guidance of the angels in a general way under the hand of God, but here we have a glimpse of their personal charge. So highly does God honor those who obey him in a spirit of meekness and love. It is a wonderful inspiration and comfort to realize that when we give our lives to God in humble dedication, he appoints us a guardian angel, not to appropriate the work of Christ, but to accompany us throughout our days, guiding us through the difficult paths and dark places, helping us in moments of spiritual danger. We probably forget the angels far too much. We neglect to tell our own little ones of their protecting power and guidance. To do so is to despise their loving condescension, and to be guilty of irreverence toward him who sent them on their mission of love. Let us meditate prayerfully upon the angels. Let us lift up our hearts in grateful acknowledgement to our Heavenly Father for the mighty one whom he has sent to stand guard over our life. Let us constantly remember him whose sacrificial love made this relationship possible. Then we shall see a Bethel, wherever a child of God is found. Book 5, Chapter 11. Never man spake like this man. The summer was almost over, and the great Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. It was a popular and joyous feast, celebrating the time when God brought out the Israelites from Egypt and caused them to sojourn in the wilderness before bringing them into the Promised Land. Combined with this celebration was what would be known today as a harvest festival, where thanksgiving was rendered after the fruits of the land had been safely gathered in. A happy atmosphere prevailed throughout the 7 days of the feast, particularly among the younger Jews. All who were physically able to do so left the comparative comfort of their homes and constructed temporary booths where they lived in carefree hardship until the feast was ended. To the observer looking down over the hundreds of hastily erected tents on the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem must have presented a strange and stirring sight. Each building would have its own covering of thickly leaved branches, whilst in every available space, clusters of tents would make their mushroom growth. It was a period, too, of intense ceremonial activity. More sacrifices were offered than at any of the other feasts. There was daily processions round the altar, solemn marches to the pool of Siloam, the singing of the Hallel, the reading of the law, the lighting of the 4 great candelabra in the court of the women. The whole picture was one of joy and thanksgiving. Jesus had not been to Jerusalem for many months, but now the city was to impel him towards his crowning work. His ministry in Galilee was virtually over. Although the majority of the common people there were still loyal and would remain so to the end, their grateful and welcoming voices were now mingled with shouts of opposition and blasphemy. During the past weeks, he had left the multitudes and sought the peace of remote places to find seclusion with his little band of disciples. As the Feast of Tabernacles drew near, and companies of Galileans from the towns and villages began to make their arrangements to travel together to Jerusalem, Christ's brothers approached him and suggested that it would be advisable for him to travel with them to the feast. They give the appearance of being puzzled rather than hostile. That Jesus was accomplishing remarkable things in Galilee, they had no doubt, but they were skeptical of his claims and anxious to put them to the more conclusive test of the temple rulers. In view of what they could only believe to be weakness in his attitude to the local scribes and Pharisees, it would not be long before he was forced to confirm that weakness or reveal his strength in the more important setting in Jerusalem. But Jesus had no desire to accompany his brothers. There are many things he must tell his disciples which cannot be shared by skeptics, whatever the blood relationship might be. The world and the church cannot accomplish a journey to Jerusalem together. My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but me it hateth, because I testify of it, that the works thereof are evil. So it was that his brothers went away without him, and Jesus, after abiding in Galilee for a little while longer, eventually set off with his disciples, as it were, in secret. Meanwhile in Jerusalem, his absence caused more disturbance than his presence. The Jewish rulers searched for him. They were now determined upon his arrest. Unable to find him, they asked each other, "Where is he?" There was equal speculation, with less decision among the people. Many said, "He is a good man." Others, "Nay, but he deceiveth the people." Much subdued murmuring prevailed. Only true knowledge of his identity and serene confidence in him will save men. The whole background of the incidents at this feast is pulsating with disturbance and perplexity, with unreserved scorn and timid loyalty. There was speculation among the people and divided opinions in the council chamber. Temple police, sent to arrest him, returned empty-handed. In ordinary circumstances, their excuse would have had dire consequences for them. Now it only brought forth a sarcastic protest. There was even a token rebellion in the Sanhedrin itself. When we seek the reason for this commotion, we realize that it was inevitable. Jesus had been away from Jerusalem for a long time. During the interval, the whole of Galilee had acclaimed him. He had had to restrain the people from making him king and marching with him into Jerusalem. He had shown miraculous powers in dealing with individuals and multitudes. Only the disciples had received the revelation of what lay before him in Jerusalem. The great majority still clung to the hope that he would manifest himself in power at the right moment. There could therefore be nothing more significant than the appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem at one of the great feasts. The Jewish rulers awaited his coming with apprehension. The people were half hoping, half fearing. Those from Galilee would undoubtedly anticipate his advent joyfully, convinced of his intentions. The people of Jerusalem, absorbing the opinion of the priests, would answer that he was a deceiver. The great feast was half over when Jesus came. He went quietly into the temple courts and began to teach. The people hearing him were immediately impressed and wondered among themselves whether the failure of the rulers to apprehend him was explained by their knowledge that he was indeed the Messiah. But they were perplexed by the lack of mystery which surrounded his origin. Howbeit, they said, "We know this man, whence he is. But when Christ cometh, no man knows whence he is." Jesus pointed beyond the beginnings which they thought they knew, to the real purpose of his coming and the identity of the one who had sent him. There lay their fatal ignorance. Such statements always provoked the rulers of Israel. There was a stir in the crowd. Several Pharisees started forward with dark scowls, intent on dragging him away. But as suddenly, they hesitated and drew back. The people were quick to notice this indecision. It was a moral victory for Jesus. Many believed on him and said, "When Christ cometh, will he do more miracles than these which this man hath done?" Perceiving the growing influence of Jesus over the people, and realizing their own inadequacy to deal with the situation, the Pharisees sought the cooperation of their enemies. For quite different reasons, the chief priests were anxious to comply, and the temple police were sent to take him. But Jesus was not taken. His hour had not yet come. He spoke to the people of remaining but a short while with them, and then going away to the one who had sent him. When he had taken that journey, they would seek him, but would not find him. This intrigued the Jews. Did he intend to go beyond the confines of Israel and teach the people of the dispersion? What a plea there is in these exchanges for the humility and teachableness of that little child who lay for a moment in his arms in the house at Capernaum. On the last day of the feast, Jesus stood forth in the temple area and made his great proclamation. If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believeth on me, as the Scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. It is probable that Jesus made this announcement as the priests were carrying the golden vessel containing the waters of Siloam, which they were to pour over the altar. How appropriate those words were from the lips of the one who was about to be the smitten rock, destined to give the water of life to the children of God in the wilderness. Once more his words caused strife and divided opinions. Many proclaimed him the prophet, others the Christ, whilst with strangest irony there were those who refused to believe at all because the Messiah should be the seed of David and be born in Bethlehem. Presently the temple officers returned to the rulers empty-handed. The failure of their mission is most eloquent testimony to the power of Christ's teaching. Going to arrest him, probably without the slightest compunction, they had been arrested themselves by his bearing and his message. Their hands, thrust out to take him, had dropped to their sides. Their harsh words of command were never uttered. They left him to confess their failure, their fear of him giving them courage to face their own masters. Never man spake like this man. How often and in how many different ways that scene has been enacted since. The Pharisees, who at this time were the most anxious of all the rulers to apprehend him, chide with the soldiers, giving vent to their disappointment and bitterness. So this man had managed to deceive them too. Is it not enough that the rulers refuse to accept him? The people doubtless are moved, but they know nothing of the law and are cursed. Quite unexpectedly, the quiet, courteous voice of Nicodemus intervened. His knowledge of Jesus and his sense of justice overcame his natural reticence. He showed how wrong the Pharisees were. It was not true that none of the rulers believed on him, and it was the Pharisees, not the people, who appeared to be ignorant of the law by condemning a man without hearing him or considering his claims. But his courage quickly evaporated when these baffled men turned the full venom of their scorn upon him. Art thou also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. Nicodemus did not accept a challenge he could have taken up successfully. He had no spirit left in him. Every man went unto his own house. Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives. Book 5, Chapter 12, Casting the First Stone. The rulers of Israel left the temple for the comfort of their own homes. The Messiah of Israel left the temple and climbed the slopes of Olivet to pray under the starry sky. How often Jesus did that! The familiar slopes that looked out over the temple have been sanctified by many nights of communion for the supreme dedication which was to be made when the hatred that seethed within those walls had exacted its price. Early in the morning, Jesus was once more in the temple. The people crowded to him, and he sat down to teach. Although the feast was now over, it is probable that many of the worshippers stayed in the city because of the presence of Jesus. The events of yesterday, though not dramatic, had created a situation of tension. There can be no doubt that the scribes and the Pharisees were determined to apprehend him, awaiting only the smallest pretext. So far their efforts had only brought humiliation upon themselves, but who could say when they would break through his defenses and effect his arrest? The Pharisees had not learned their lesson. They were humbled but not discouraged. Determined to achieve their object, they did not hesitate to use a woman's shame to achieve their ends. The quiet scene in the courts was interrupted by a group of scribes and Pharisees, dragging to him a terrified and disheveled woman. Careless of her feelings, they sought only to make her the instrument of their enmity against him. Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Here was the irrefutable evidence. Now they could lay their snare. Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? It was a problem not without subtlety and danger. These men knew the attitude of Jesus towards publicans and sinners, and they were reasonably certain that he would not allow her to be stoned. This would immediately expose him to the accusation that he was deliberately refuting the law of Moses, an accusation which would only be partly mitigated by the fact that stoning was not now the general practice in such cases. In the remote event of his endorsing the law of Moses, their victory could be greater. He would both incur the displeasure of the people for his inconsistency and the political charge that he was challenging the prerogative of Rome. Thus his enemies thought they had a strong case. At best they would arrest him, and in any event they would succeed in breaking the people's confidence in him. They had set the scene of this unhappy drama. They watched him now, triumph and hate shining in their eyes. The crowds pressed around breathlessly. The half-clothed, bareheaded woman, taunt with a shame even greater than her fear, stood exposed to their hungry gaze. She dare not lift her eyes to this man whom the rulers had appointed to be her judge. She knew nothing of the plot that lay behind this last terrible hour. But her judge did not look at her. Entering into her feelings, his love spared her that. He bent forward from his sitting position and wrote in the dust. His action was a silent plea to the conscience of those men, made heartless by their hatred. With an eloquence which no words could equal, he was telling them to leave the poor woman alone, to relieve him of the constraint of speaking. He gave them time to allow their own hearts to convict them. Had they gone away then, they would have been humbled, but it would be as nothing compared to the abasement to which Jesus was so loath to commit them. As was so often the case, they mistook his strength for weakness. They were blind to everything but his apparent indecision. They continued their demand, spurning the escape he had offered them. The moment came when there could be no evasion of the judgment for which they asked. The Lord stood up and searched the faces of these rulers of Israel who had stooped so low. His eyes burned with anger as he looked from one to the other. Never before had they felt the stature and holiness of the man who stood before them. They became conscious that they were mean and graceless. Their assurance shriveled under his steady gaze, which seared into their souls, sparing none of the evil things now exposed there. They saw the enormity of their action. Then he spoke. "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." That was all he needed to say. He stooped and resumed his writing, waiting once more for their consciences to work. In the morning shadows of the temple, in full view of the expectant crowds, they looked strangely one at another, until they could bear each other's glances no more. He had not accused any of them. He had left it to each one to decide. Jesus was taking no notice of them. He had no desire to be a witness of their humiliation. He was only grieved that it had become necessary. They watched his stooping form, conscious that at any moment he could stand up and challenge them, and they would have nothing to say. Silently, each made the inevitable confession of his guilt. The oldest of them edged into the crowd and was lost to view. One by one, the others too melted away until none was left. The woman could have gone too, but she stayed. Something bigger than her fear and her shame kept her near Jesus. He rose, and for the first time looked her full in the face. "Woman, where are thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee?" "No man, Lord." She was not so distracted that she was blind to the reason for the slow departure of her accusers. Looking into the face of Jesus, strong, pure, heavenly, she saw the full degradation of her willful passion. Surely there were tears of penitence in her eyes. "Neither do I condemn thee. Go, and sin no more." Jesus did not condone her sin, did not even offer her forgiveness and peace. Sinners could not condemn her, neither would the one who was without sin. Jesus left it to her to merit forgiveness by her future conduct and faith. But he had given her a glimpse of the mercy and grace that were waiting for her appeal. Although we hear nothing more of her, we may hope that, though she went away at his command, she would come back of her own free will, her desires sublimated, to join the little company of women who loved much because they had been forgiven much. This incident has proved invaluable in Christian history. It is a graphic exposition of the Master's words on the Mount, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." However damning the evidence may be against our brother, if we pause and look into our own hearts, we shall go quietly away and leave him with his Lord. There are times when it becomes necessary to take action, but that action must not be taken because we have condemned our brother. It will be taken in the painful consciousness of our own unworthiness, and with a love which will plead intercession before the throne of grace. We shall wait with eagerness for the first signs of penitence, so that we can joyfully restore the erring one to the fellowship of the saints. Book 5, Chapter 13. Thou hast seen him. Later the same day, Jesus stood up in the temple and proclaimed himself the light of the world. The claim was immediately repudiated by the Pharisees, and a verbal battle ensued, which resulted in many of the people, and even some of the rulers, believing on him. But in most of them it was a superficial faith, which failed to stand the test to which it was now exposed. The Jews resorted to the familiar claim that they were the children of Abraham. This would not do, Jesus observed, since unlike them, Abraham had rejoiced to see his day. "Thou art not yet 50 years old," they cried, "and hast thou seen Abraham? Verily, verily, I say unto you, that before Abraham was, I am." This dramatic assertion was altogether too much for them. Deeds, not words, could be the only answer to this apparent blasphemy. They took up stones, but Jesus moved away into a crowd that was not altogether hostile, and left the temple. A thought of surpassing loveliness is often lost by the artificial break between the 8th and 9th chapters of John. If we link the two verses, it immediately becomes apparent. Following the dispute in the temple, the Jews took up stones to cast at Jesus. He went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. And as he passed by, he saw a man that was blind from his birth. Escaping from men intent upon his hurt, Jesus found the need of man a barrier he could not pass. Here is an epitome of his life. From the beginning of his ministry, this persecution had gone on, intensifying with the passing months until it reached its terrible climax. But it never interrupted his gentle ministration of love, or dulled his ear to the cry of man. His enemies did not succeed in diverting him from his purpose, and by a sublime paradox, when at last they nailed him to the cross, he achieved his greatest victory in satisfying man's deepest need. The blind man was probably begging in the precincts of the temple. The knowledge that he was born blind indicates that he was a familiar figure there, and his history well known. The disciples, puzzled by the general belief in the close relationship between sin and suffering, asked Jesus whether this man had sinned or his parents. The Jews persisted in believing in this connection in spite of the lesson of the book of Job. They took it to illogical lengths, so that when they found a man inflicted from birth, they were driven to the point of proclaiming it to be the result of prenatal sin. That there is an affinity between sin and suffering, and sometimes a direct connection, Jesus did not deny. But to assume that connection in every case by a cruel scrutiny of the secret life of a sufferer was false in principle and morally wrong. Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Jesus refrained from discussing the subject, confining his attention to the man's need and his power to help. God's purpose was that his work should be manifested in this blind beggar, and that by his natural and spiritual sight he would be a witness to the light of the world. As the shadows of this day were lengthening, so the day of his own earthly life was drawing to its close, and with it would go these opportunities of loving service. I must work the works of him that sent me, while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. No more fitting work could be found for the light of the world than the opening of the eyes of the blind, unless it were the opening also of the eyes of his understanding. And such was his purpose now. The blind man was leaning against the wall of the temple. He had been crying out to passers-by for alms. Now, as the sound of footsteps stopped before him, he waited expectantly. The inconsiderate words of the disciples had little effect upon a man hardened by years of charity. But for the first time he heard the voice of Jesus. With the enhanced sensitiveness of the blind, he felt instantly the strength of the one who spoke. He had heard of the man from Galilee who was creating so much stir in the temple. The words he now listened to were beyond his comprehension, but he suddenly knew that this man intended to do something for him. Suddenly he felt his eyelids touched by strong, purposeful fingers. A damp heaviness pressed against them. Then that rich voice spoke again, but this time directly to him. "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." Without hesitation he obeyed. He began his long journey through the narrow, crowded streets of the lower city. Reaching the end of the temple wall, his rapidly tapping stick would no longer find the familiar landmarks. He would lift his voice to cry, not for alms, but for guidance to those waters which would take away his blindness and bring him into a new world of light and beauty. Passers-by would look in astonishment at the man with a clay-spattered face, groping uncertainly but with set purpose along the tortuous streets, calling with pathetic eagerness to be led to the pool of Siloam. Perhaps a friendly hand would take his arm and shorten his journey. At last he stood beside the waters, washing his eyes. In a breathless moment he looked out upon a world of movement and color. The sounds and sensations of a lifetime took form and beauty. John says simply, "He went his way therefore and washed, and came seeing." He would no doubt make his way through his new world to seek his benefactor. Unable to find him, he would joyfully hurry to behold for the first time his parents and his home. Neighbors looking upon this figure, so familiar yet so changed by his radiant smile and his shining eyes, questioned his identity, only to be assured that he was indeed the man who had sat and begged. The neighbors decided that their best course was to take him to the Pharisees. To them he answered simply, "He put clay upon my eyes, and I washed and do see." This stirred up that division among them that had been so evident all day. There were those who dismissed the Lord's claims because he had broken the Sabbath, but there were others who reflected, "How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles?" But the hostility prevailed. The timidity on the side of conscience continued to the end, and only found full expression when there was left a lifeless body to wrap in grave clothes and place reverently in a tomb. The interview which followed is an example of the power of simple truth over perversity. The Pharisees were made to look ridiculous. Their only remedy to preserve their tattered dignity was to hurt the man Jesus had healed. The next question betrayed their confusion. What did he think of his benefactor? "He is a prophet." Question and answer solved nothing. A moment ago they had appeared satisfied with the genuineness of the case. Now they reopened the matter by questioning the man's parents. This was futile. They confirmed that he was their son and that he had been born blind. With the threat of excommunication hanging over them, they felt their announcement sufficiently bold. "He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself." They turned to him again. "Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner." He replied with sincere humility, but with none of his parents' fear. "Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not." But his words unconsciously turned to irony as he added this simple truth: "One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see." The Pharisees had been driven back to their starting point. They asked him again how Jesus opened his eyes. But under this fatuous inquisition, the young man grew impatient. Now they hated his benefactor. Their stubbornness was stimulating his faith in Jesus. "I have told you already, and ye did not hear. Wherefore should ye hear it again? Will ye also be his disciples?" His artless reply stung them to the quick. He could have said nothing more calculated to reduce them to impotent rage than the suggestion that they should be disciples of Jesus. But he had succeeded in turning their attack into defense. "Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not whence he is." Yet in appealing to Moses, they were appealing to the one who proclaimed the coming of the greater prophet to whom they must turn or be consumed. The restored man would have known nothing of this, but their words had revealed to his quick brain a gaping hole in their reasoning. With growing confidence, the man who sees begins to instruct the blind. At first, he had confessed that he knew not whether Jesus was a sinner. Now they had fully convinced him that he was not. Why, herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners. But if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. This was altogether too much for the Pharisees. The interview had assumed a grotesque form. It could only have one ending if they were to salvage the slightest vestige of their dignity. They still had the power to ruin him. Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. It is an age-old remedy. Not only would he no longer worship, but he was ostracized from society, and would find all the doors of employment closed to him. Even those who engaged in conversation with him would be frowned upon. In view of the timidity of his parents, it is possible that he would be turned out from his own home. But the record does not end there. Such a loyalty to Christ will always have the same glorious sequel. How many days of loneliness and persecution the young man endured, we do not know, but he was ready now for the complete enlightenment of spiritual vision. Jesus heard that he had been cast out, and he went in search of him. And when he found him, he said unto him, Dost thou believe in the Son of God? The estranged man would immediately recognize that voice and know who stood before him. For the first time, his eyes reverently searched the face of the one who had made him whole. His reply seems to sense the impending revelation and promised obedience. Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? With what loving appropriateness, Jesus finally reveals himself by reminding him of the evidence which supports his claim. Thou hast seen him, and to remove the last shadow of doubt, it is he that talketh with thee. And so this poignant scene ended in the only possible way. John records it, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. We cannot leave this dramatic incident without briefly suggesting its lesson. As we have seen, the signs of John's Gospel contain the particular purpose of illustrating the great spiritual truths of Christ's work. This miracle set forth the claim that Jesus had made in the temple a few hours before. It showed him to be the light of the world. The blind man begging at the gate of the temple is a powerful symbol of the blindness and poverty of man, proclaiming his need at the gateway of heaven. The power to remove both, for one is largely determined by the other, is revealed by the coming of the Son of Man. Our blind eyes are touched by the ointment prepared by the mingling of the dust of the ground with the moisture from the mouth of him who is sent from heaven. But this does not cure us. We receive the command to go and wash in the waters of apostleship. John is careful to point out that Siloam means sent. It is a long and difficult journey. Some do not undertake it at all. Some begin only to give up and resume their begging at the gate. Often it is made shorter and easier by the friendly guidance of one who can see. It is the responsibility of all enlightened ones to listen for the tapping of the stick and the cry to be directed to the waters of Siloam. But faith and obedience are rewarded. With the washing of the waters, we enter a new world illuminated by the Sun of Righteousness. This may mean estrangement, persecution, and sacrifice, but it will also be an opportunity for witness and loyalty. Jesus will know. He will seek us out and invite us into a fellowship so deep and abiding that all the former relationships are like the phantom sounds and movements of the dark world from which we have been delivered. For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see, and they which see might be made blind.